Welcome to A State of Mind. This is Julian Royce. Thank you so much for tuning in. So great to have you all here. Really excited about today's episode. Today I'm speaking with Stephen Hatch. Stephen is someone who I met at Naropa University as a teacher. He taught there for many years. He taught Contemplative Christianity. He has a really deep connection with nature and the wilderness. And so really is a kind of, nature mysticism is right up his alley. And if you follow him on social media, you'll see these amazing photos that he takes with beautiful words, some of his own, sometimes with quotes that he shares. And this was just a really good, deep conversation into mystical Christianity. And it's a fascinating subject, and I think very relevant for many listeners of this podcast. Check out the show notes below for a list of topics. And as always, you can learn more about my work as a therapist, a meditation teacher at astateofmindcounseling.org. And you can support this podcast at our Patreon page, patreon.com/astateofmind. One note, there was a technical problem in the video. So if you're watching on YouTube, you're only going to be able to see Stephen during our conversation instead of going back and forth between our respective faces. So I apologize about that. The problem has been fixed for future episodes, but just did the best we could do with this one. And I wanted to give some updates about my own life and what I've been going through. I realize that we live, in a world, to simplify things, where we just see the appearance of other people, and we don't often know what's really going on with them unless we take time with them, unless we drop in with them and they tell us. And obviously social media amplifies this thing of where we're seeing other people's lives in this kind of image, and things often look very positive, right? Because that's the image people want to give out. And so if you're listening to this podcast, I don't want to be doing that all the time myself. I'm not always doing great, to be honest. And I think it's important to share that. And so it was really like 2 weeks ago, I was going through a rough patch in my own life. And then I got sick, which made it more difficult. And I just remember it was pouring with snow and cold outside, and I had to take my dog out and just standing there in this cold snow and what is happening? And I remember just being there and feeling, wow, I'm sick, it's cold, it's wet, it's at night, I'm out here with my dog who's running around like crazy. And yeah, it's just kind of recognizing this is a low moment for me. And there was value in just being with that and accepting it and bringing my mindfulness to that, my tools to that. So I think that part of my own practice and work has been that I can feel things more fully, for better or worse, and then move through them more quickly. Then the following weekend, I got to participate in this Tony Robbins virtual seminar with a group of friends, and the community was really supportive. I wanted to share a little bit about that and some of the things I got from it. Tony Robbins, whether you love him or hate him, whether you know his work or not, he is a great communicator, and he is really offering what he calls practical psychology, an understanding of our mind, our physiology, and our emotions, and how to make use of those to get more of what we want in life, more happiness, more well-being. And he broke something down in a way that I found really powerful, and people that I've been sharing it with have found really powerful, which is you can take this complex process of attention and break it down into just these three simple parts. What are you focusing on? What is the meaning that you give it? And what emotion is that creating for you? And so we know from mindfulness how important what you give your attention to is. And so I'm really grateful for everyone who listens to this. You're giving your attention to this, and I hope that it is super rewarding, that it's really worthwhile. A lot of the things we give our attention to are not rewarding, and they're not worthwhile. Obviously, social media, comparing ourselves to others. So just in terms of this first piece, what are you focusing on? What are you putting your attention on day to day? And there's three things that if you are focusing on will increase your chance of depression, of not feeling good. And I've saw this in myself, and I see it in people I'm working with. And so one of them is, are you focusing on what you can control or what you can't control? And if you're spending more time focusing on what you cannot control, again, it's more likely to lead to depression, hopelessness, even despair in extreme cases. Are you focusing on what you have or what you don't have? And this is a really big one. Everyone who's listening to this has good things in your life, and you can focus on those and you can appreciate them, and that appreciation can grow and you can live in gratitude. And then the final piece is, are you focusing on the past, the present, or the future? And if we spend a lot of our time focusing on the past, especially in a negative way with negative memories or difficult experiences, that again will tend to lead to depression and not feeling so good and not feeling so energized, excited, or inspired in your life today. And so we don't want to over-focus on the past. We want to have a balance there and to have a positive future that we are envisioning and working to create for ourselves, and to stay present in that process. It's so important, so valuable. So I just briefly wanted to offer this. There's a lot more that could be said about it, of course, but take some time today if you can and just notice, be aware of what you are focusing on and see if you can make that process more conscious. Focus on what you have rather than what you don't have. Focus on what you can control rather than things that are outside of your control. And focus on the present, being in the present moment. So, without further ado, I bring you this conversation with Contemplative Christianity expert and teacher, Stephen Hatch. So I'm here today with Stephen Hatch. Stephen, thank you for joining us on the podcast.
You're welcome.
And we were just talking before we started recording that I met you when you were a guest lecturer at a class at Naropa University. I believe the class was called Centering Prayer. And I was in the religious studies department, and it was about Christian contemplative practice, basically.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So do you want to introduce yourself a little bit? I know you have a long background with Christian Mysticism. Is that a good way to describe it?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I grew up in Pennsylvania, southeast Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia, where I lived till I was 17 years old. On my dad's side, they were Armenian immigrants when the genocide was happening with Armenians. My grandfather came over to the States in the early part of the 20th century. And my name was Hachadorian, and he shortened it to Hatch, to make it sound more anglicized. On my mom's side, they were prominent Pennsylvania Quakers. So the Quaker spirituality, and I lived 2 miles from Haverford College, which was a prominent Quaker college. So I really absorbed that kind of egalitarian Protestant spirituality and the mystical aspect of the importance of silence and the inner life. My parents, however, had become more fundamentalist, and I was raised in a Baptist church, and they didn't like to talk much about the Quaker views, but I felt like I absorbed it in the water. I mean, Pennsylvania was the Quaker state. It was founded as a kind of a Quaker colony, one of the original 13 colonies. And so
interesting.
I grew up a Baptist, and I enjoyed the sense of fellowship there and the learning that I received on the scriptures. But when I was in high school, I developed a real interest in nature. Actually, before that, from junior high. And I ended up going to college in Colorado, where I lived for 45 years. And first, I was going to go into natural resources management in the forestry school, but I realized after some classes that science wasn't the avenue for me to try to understand the increasingly mystical experiences that I was having in nature. So I switched to philosophy and religion at Colorado State University. And that's where I got really interested in interreligious dialogue, Eastern mysticism, and delved more in depth into Christian mysticism. I also had a professor who has been nicknamed the grandfather of environmental ethics. His name was Holmes Ralston III, and he taught at Colorado State. So after I finished my schooling there, I got connected with Father Thomas Keating through the St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado. And I decided I wanted to try to live as a monk in the world. At the time, that was sort of a popular thing. There was a book by Marcia Sinitar called Ordinary People as Monks and Mystics.
Oh, interesting. What year around would this have been?
Let's see. I met Thomas Keating in 1982.
Oh, okay.
So he actually had retired as the abbot of a Trappist monastery in Massachusetts and was the guest master. And so he was just starting to teach centering prayer in Colorado, and it was before he actually formed Contemplative Outreach. And after he did, I ended up going to seminary at Iliff School of Theology in Denver, where I majored in Christian mysticism. And then I worked for Thomas's Contemplative Outreach for several years.
What was the name of the school?
Iliff School of Theology.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's right next to University of Denver in Denver. I really developed an interest in integrating Christian mysticism with my spirituality of nature. In fact, I had a guest professor there, Belden Lane, who has written a lot about landscapes of the sacred, including the Puritans and the Calvinists and how they contribute to the wilderness ethic in the United States. And but after I left seminary, I taught for Thomas for Contemplative Outreach for a few years, and then I ended up giving retreats, workshops, and seminars on nature, spirituality, male spirituality, women's spirituality, the Enneagram, and all of it with a slant in the natural world, communion with the natural world. And eventually I started teaching at Naropa University, 2 courses in Christian mysticism, beginning, I believe it was about 2008. And taught there for 11 years and as an adjunct professor. And then I ended up, just as the pandemic was starting, I moved to and I lived here for 2 years. And I thought I was going to launch right into teaching retreats and workshops. But I realized there's a whole culture here that I needed to just sit with and learn about. People who've lived here 500 years, 1,000 years, their families. And I was a newcomer. So I have spent a lot of time listening to people's stories, and am still looking for the right opportunity to start teaching here.
Interesting. Yeah, I appreciate that. That was captured your life pretty quickly. Yeah, but obviously a lifelong interest in nature, in mysticism, in spirituality.
Yeah, it's been my life.
That's beautiful. I know you're from Naropa. Did you ever have any, you must have seen students that, did you see students who were kind of struggling with Christianity versus something like, say, Buddhism?
Yeah, actually, that happened a lot. So there were a lot of students who had some kind of a background in Christianity where they had negative experiences,
Right.
A sense of judgment or guilt or narrow-mindedness. So it was kind of interesting. So they would end up going east, They would embrace a Hindu path or a Buddhist path. And so they'd come into my class often thinking they were going to get nothing out of it, and came to realize that Christian mysticism was a very rich tradition, and it has a whole tradition of, I always talk about varieties of non-dualism. It has a rich tradition of non-dualism that's a bit different from the East. But it helped that I took each student, if they wanted to, I took them out for coffee at a local coffee shop where we really didn't discuss the class. I just wanted to hear about their spiritual journey. And for some reason, that just really resonated with a lot of students. I think they weren't used to someone taking them out for coffee just to listen to their story. So I found many rich relationships through that continue to this day.
That's beautiful.
And I married several sets of students, performed their weddings. So.
Oh, wow. Oh, you didn't marry the students. You helped officiate their wedding.
Yeah, two of them actually met in one of my classes.
Oh, wow. No, that's really cool.
So I did their wedding at the Butterfly Pavilion in near Denver there. That was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I asked that question because I've talked to people like that, and it's just an interesting thing. And
Yeah, yeah.
actually, I have a little bit randomly, but I have a friend who's about to go on a pretty long meditation retreat, and he's really into Buddhism and the Buddhist path.
Yeah.
And then I got to see him before he left, and I made some joke about God, like, does God approve of this or something? Because he mentioned his family was Catholic, and
Oh,
it kind of set off this whole thing where he's like, I don't know what God thinks about this, and he was like talking as if God was a person there that he was, so it just was clear that there was something there around his Christian upbringing and then him following this Buddhist path, and I think a
yeah.
lot of people that get into that kind of a thing can relate to that. Of course, then there's some people who are like I was raised with no religion and got into meditation, and
Yeah.
there's such a varied landscape in terms of spirituality and meditation today.
I think too, people in our society feel like they reject their upbringing to go to something else. But I think even though that you might think that you let go of a certain tradition, the tradition never lets go of you. So it's in your background, whether you want it to be or not. So I think it's important for people of all faiths or no faith to reconcile themselves to their upbringing and to be able to include it in their current path rather than simply rejecting it.
Hmm.
Because
I come to a more mature understanding
yeah,
with it.
it'll come back to bite. The shadow side of it will come back to bite you if you don't deal with it head on. Thomas Merton said that once. He said you might as well talk to your inner demons, invite them in the front door, and have a good conversation with them. Otherwise, they'll come in the back door and cause all kinds of havoc.
That's a good one.
Mhm. People always say that, oh, I grew up Catholic, and it was horrible, so I took a different path, and they feel like they've rejected it, but it's not. The path is still a part of them.
Mm.
So I think that's an interesting phenomenon.
Yeah, yeah, and it can be challenging, right, to wrestle with that or make sense of
Yeah,
that. Like I was
well,
just.
I had to reconcile myself to my fundamentalist upbringing, and
Mm,
I don't have any, I don't have bad thoughts about it. I realized that it was part of the truth, only a slice of the truth, and it taught me some really valuable things. And not only negative things, there's parts of it that I carry with me to this day, even though I consider myself more interspiritual now.
interspiritual, interesting.
Yeah.
Well, what would you say if someone's listening, like for you, like what are some of the positives that you got from the fundamentalist upbringing?
Well, there was a real sense of fellowship. There was a sense of intimacy. Uh, you know, you hug everybody. Um, a real warmth. The sense, like Wednesday nights, there was always a church dinner. Uh, I grew up, I had quite a community of, other young people there. And I really learned the Bible inside out and out. And I'm really grateful for that. Also, it was the Baptist tradition, conservative Baptist tradition. And when I look at the roots of that, I mean, it was founded in a real egalitarian kind of mindset where you believe the Spirit could speak to you at any moment.
Mm,
You really believed in the indwelling Spirit, and so all of those things I think are really good, and they've carried me through uh, to make me who I am.
yeah, yeah, I appreciate that. I just read the other day there were these a teacher I followed named Christopher Wallace posted these quotes from Carl Jung, where
Uh-huh.
he basically is saying that Westerners or people from Europe or America shouldn't try to follow yoga. They shouldn't try to do that because whether they like it or not, their unconsciousness is
Yeah,
Christian. Is kind of basically what he was saying,
yeah.
and he was saying that he learns and appreciates these yoga systems that he had studied, but that he didn't recommend anyone from this culture try to go there because our cultures are so different. And it's interesting to read that all these years later now, like 90 years after he wrote it or whatever. Do you have any thoughts
Yeah,
about that?
Carl Jung really believed that one needed to reconcile oneself, especially growing up in the West, reconcile oneself to the Western tradition, even if you do go East, to reconcile yourself to it and include it in your path. I mean, there's people that do that. A lot of Buddhist teachers like have a Jewish background. I think of Sylvia Boorstein. I remember hearing her. She was like a Jewish grandmother teaching Buddhist meditation. Oh, she was wonderful. She had such a warmth about her, and she really showed how the inner tradition of Judaism really helped her interpret Buddhism in a more personal way for her. And she really radiated that kind of personal approach.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, on this topic, would you describe yourself as Christian or as something in particular? How do you?
Yeah. So I describe myself as a contemplative Christian who has a particular bent in discovering communion with God, with Christ, and with the sacred feminine, who in the Christian tradition is called Sophia, through the vehicle of nature. And so I started calling that wilderness mysticism, and I've written a book about it as a particular type of Christian mysticism. After all, it was many of the landscape images that attracted me in the beginning to Christian mysticism. But I consider myself intraspiritual. Now, of course, as the book, the New Monasticism says, there's different ways of being intraspiritual. One of them is you sort of stay in one tradition and then you learn from a handful of others. Second way is that you identify with maybe several traditions, multiple belonging. And a third way is that maybe you don't identify with any one tradition, but you sort of gather pieces from all the traditions. I would say I'm mostly the first. I'm definitely a contemplative Christian, but I learned so much from other traditions, and I learned about the richness of my own tradition from particularly Buddhist traditions, Native American traditions, some of the Sufi traditions, and some of the others. And I view, to be honest, I view Christian mysticism, the contemplative path is to listen for the presence of God, the presence of the divine in whatever situation or person or landscape you're in. So really to be a Christian is to look out at the world through Christ's eyes, not primarily to look at Christ. Obviously, you do that in the beginning because you're trying to become formed according to the presence of Christ, the living Christ. But after a while, he kind of disappears as an object of study because you are starting to look out at the world through his eyes. And for me, a lot of that is really listening to uncover the presence of the divine in whoever you're with. It's not at all a proselytizing kind of mindset. And I do spiritual direction. So whenever I have a spiritual direction client, I always seek to see where the divine has already been working in their lives and then build on that. So to me, to be a Christian is to listen for the presence of the divine in whoever you're with, and then to foster that. What makes it being a Christian kind of listening is I think that the presence of Christ, if you look at it in the context of all the world religions, each world religion has kind of a different flavor. The Christian flavor or filter is a kind of a quiet warmth that sort of permeates that listening.
So to say that again, that to be a Christian is to listen to the presence of the divine in whoever you are with. Is that what you said?
Yeah, whoever you're with.
Beautiful.
And it's the quality of the listening that makes it Christian, not the content of what you're talking about with the person.
Oh, I like that.
So you may never talk about Christ with the person, but instead, to the best of your ability, and sometimes it only comes together in little flashes, you mediate the presence of Christ. You become Christ. And to uncover the divine in the other person. I really don't believe that Jesus went around saying, look at me, look at me. In some of the Gospels, he would perform a healing, And then at the end of the healing, he would ask the person, he'd say, no, don't tell anyone about this. And then poof, he would like disappear into the crowd. So it was almost a trickster kind of approach, to that. So the other aspect, of course, about Christian mysticism is the whole idea of kenosis, which is the Greek word for self-emptying. So a true Christian contemplative really believes in that sort of self-emptying, which means emptying yourself of what your identity is at the time to truly be with the person or the landscape that you're with, to really listen and learn from. That's another way that I experience God in the silence. I feel that I am listened to and learned from. And that, as everyone knows, when someone is there that they value, to learn from them, it opens up all kinds of creativity they didn't even know was there. So that's what God does with us in the silence. So that's what we're meant to do with others, is to really listen and learn from them.
Beautiful.
And uncover depths of the divine riches that we might not have known were there. After all, it's a divine adventure. I think I'm a full believer in process theology, which says that there's an aspect of the divine, of God, that that is in process, that's learning through human experience.
Oh, interesting.
So, yeah, I fully
familiar
agree
with
with that approach. And the world needs people who listen and learn from. So for me, I'm intraspiritual, and I'm a Christian in the sense that I at my best, I'm looking out at the world through Christ's eyes. I'm not looking at Christ, I'm looking at the world. And sometimes in the Gospels, Christ is talked about as the light of the world. Well, the light doesn't shine on itself, it shines on the world. So you can see the world better. It's not always talking about itself and how great it is. It's looking at the world. So, yeah, I think that for me, that's what my interspiritual Christian path is about.
Wow, yeah. No, I appreciate that a lot. That was so beautiful. There's so much in what you just shared. Yeah, I noticed when you started talking and using the word Christ and using God, the word God, I do have like something in myself that's like, what, a little bit of a reaction against it because of my maybe upbringing in the South and associations with Christianity, and sometimes sometimes I just feel that way with religion in general. Even there's a Buddhist teacher talking about Buddha nature, or the Buddha that, the Buddha this, and there's like this
Right.
and then sometimes I get really into it. I'm like, I love that, and it makes sense, and it resonates with me, and it's a really interesting to watch my mind kind of work with some of the language. But I think for me, I can distinguish the language from the reality that you're trying to invoke or speak to, right? You like seeing through the eyes of Christ. It's like you're not talking about joining a particular group and having a certain belief. You're talking about a process. Like yoga is a kind of process, right? That's
right.
A path. Yeah.
No, that's a really good point. There was a time that I went through, maybe in the 80s, where I didn't want to use the word God anymore because the fundamentalists, that sort of approach of a sort of a male being who was maybe looking at your every move and maybe judging you and that sort of thing. And I didn't want anything to do with that. So I would talk about the ultimate mystery, or the great mystery, or the divine. And I got to a point where I thought, you know what, I'm not going to let the fundamentalists have ownership of the word God. So I went back to using it. And, to me, it's a way of talking about, the Christian mystics talk about the ground of being, the ground. It's a way of talking about that mysterious ground that underlies all things, or that spacious awareness. And what makes that Christian is that spaciousness and the ground of being has a sort of personal quality to you. It radiates love, and it wants to have a relationship with you. So there's a personal quality to that, and that's what makes it when we talk about God. But it doesn't really matter what term you use. It's what presence do you radiate out to the world?
Yeah.
Same with Christ. I mean, Christ, there's a distinction between Jesus and Christ. just as there's a distinction between the Gautama Buddha and Buddha nature. So Jesus was a person who lived his life so much in conformity to what we often call the universal Christ or the cosmic Christ, the wisdom that indwells all things, that his personality started to suffuse our experience of that wisdom. But we're really talking about Christ, not so much just Jesus. And actually, in my theology, Christ, sometimes we talk about Christ consciousness, is actually not just Jesus, it's Jesus and Mary Magdalene together.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
Two of them together make up the Christ.
Okay. Yeah, definitely want to talk about that with you. So I guess while we're jumping into these theological deep waters, which is awesome, when you think, I guess in your own understanding, your own theology, however you want to describe it, when you think about Jesus Christ, the person, is there something uniquely special about him that's different from every other person that's ever lived, or you have a different understanding there? Because that's like seems like a fundamental tenet of Christianity.
Well, first of all, I think every person is unique and unlike any other person that's ever lived.
All right.
Jesus is a person. I mean, there's a bunch of us, and including people from other religions. Sometimes people in the Hindu faith understand Christ better than Christians do. There's a certain flavor or a certain personality that you relate to. He's a wisdom teacher. He travels around. He's itinerant. Like he says, the son of humanity, meaning himself has nowhere to lay his head. So they're sleeping in fields or
that's interesting, because the Buddha called himself homeless, and the original word for monks in Buddhism that the Buddha gave was homeless, becoming homeless.
Right. So was Jesus. I mean, he just focused on really awakening the faith of people. I mean, he'd do a healing, and he wouldn't say, "I've just healed you." He said, "Your faith has healed you." So he awakened the faith in other people, and he was very self-emptying, and he cared a lot about the poor and the outcasts of society. The modern day, the way Jesus is framed in modern day evangelical Christianity is completely off base, because Jesus favored the poor and the outcast and those who were considered lower. And he hung out with people that no one else wanted to hang out with. He was good friends with tax collectors who were considered the scum of the earth, and prostitutes. And he was very unique in many ways. But I wouldn't say that he's more unique than anyone is in the world. It's just there's a group of us that, and I talked earlier about the Quaker Faith. Of course, the Quaker Faith emphasizes the inner indwelling Christ. So there is that inner presence. But I remember when I first met, so my spiritual mentor was Thomas Keating. And, everybody has these arguments. Who's Jesus? Was he originally the Son of God? Was he human, divine, or both, or whatever? When I met Thomas, I thought, oh, this is what we're talking about when we talk about Christ.
Oh, wow.
It's sort of like the transmission that occurs in many Eastern traditions between the teacher, and the spiritual presence that you're, devoted to. That's how I felt with Thomas Keating. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what Christ is about. I get it. And in some ways, you can't put that into words, but it's a warmth and a caring and a listening and no arrogance. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Yeah, I appreciate that. I guess, the mainstream Christian doctrine that Jesus was the Son of God in a way that other people aren't or something. And
right.
To kind of simplify it, in my understanding, like if I had to give like a quick definition of mysticism, it's that the divine, whatever that is within all of us, or all things, or it's immanent as well as transcendent. And so I think there was this esoteric, mystical tradition within Christianity that was esoteric because it wasn't politically allowed, it was suppressed, and it was kind of kept in secret, but it had these similar beliefs that you're describing, perhaps.
Actually, it wasn't so secret. A lot of the saints of the church were mystics. So, and it's right there in the Bible. open, plain for all to see. So it just got ignored. It's like hidden in plain sight.
Yeah.
And so, of course, the people who express themselves, the mystics who express themselves with especially creative language, they often got into trouble. Wanted to identify the inner soul with God, like Meister Eckhart or whatever. But they were really only sharing teachings that had been there all along. I mean, a group of teachers, the Pharisees, come to Jesus and say, "How can you only be human? How can you claim to be a son of God?" He says, "Well, in your own scriptures, it says," and he quotes the Psalms, "We are all God's sons and daughters of the Most High." So he's like, it's right there.
Yeah, it's such a rich, interesting history.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that point. Maybe a lot of people believe that early church had a more mystical understanding, that these were more a part of that, and then it became so politicized, right? That's this whole political history.
Well, most of before the church split into the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East, or the Eastern Church, and then the Western Church, in Rome, much of the teaching came out of the East. That is Egypt and Syria and Asia Minor. The church, quote, the church fathers were from those places, and they had an innately mystical understanding. I mean, even in the Council of Nicaea, where they said that Jesus was divine, he wasn't just a human that appeared to be divine. The whole purpose for that teaching was, if Jesus was a human who was divine, then we could be divine too. That's why they held on to that. Otherwise, if humans couldn't be divine, we couldn't be divine if Jesus as a human wasn't divine. So people forget about that. Mysticism was there from the very beginning.
Beautiful. Yeah. Well, I want to go back to what you said about Mary Magdalene. Can you speak to that more?
Yeah. So that is one thing that the church did. It suppressed the understanding of Mary Magdalene as the chief apostle. So when Jesus is resurrected, who does he appear to? He appears to Mary. And Mary is really the only one that often got his teachings. And so what happened was, she's mentioned lightly in the Bible, but of course, in the 20th century, they suddenly discover these scrolls hidden in clay jars in a cave, and lo and behold, a lot of those scrolls have teachings from Mary Magdalene. And so they started to realize that something had been, the Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, I'm talking about, the Nag Hammadi, and so many of those texts talk about Mary Magdalene as being the one apostle who really got Jesus. So there's the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, where a huge center part of that was ripped out. Even in the one that they discovered in the cave there, Gospel of Philip, Gospel of Thomas, and they started to see that Mary was basically taken out. She was identified as a prostitute and then sort of, kind of written out of human history, but they discovered that wasn't really the case at all. She was the one that really got Jesus. And Peter had a huge, problem with her. He felt real competition, but she was the one that really got Jesus' teachings. And as Cynthia Bourgeault and other teachings have said, the two were together. Now, whether they were married or had intimate relations, we don't know, but for sure they had a spiritual intimate relationship, or each learned from the other. Jesus learned more of warmth and compassion, and to be able to see the true humanity from Mary, and Mary learned about transcendence from Jesus. So I think we're sort of moving beyond what some might call a patriarchal understanding of spirituality, that one person has it all together. Instead, realize it's in a relationship that you grow.
Wow.
That could be many types of relationships, but in that case, it was Jesus and Mary together. I often think in my own spirituality and the practices I do, I think of Jesus as the light and Mary as the warmth. And the warmth and the light go together. But a huge amount of work is being done now to uncover what was left out.
Yeah, and so you said that even in the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, within those scrolls, there were passages about Mary Magdalene that had been ripped out in centuries past before they were discovered.
What happened then, Cynthia Bourgeot, who you may know is an Episcopalian priest who's written a lot about this. What happened was, the story, of course, was that Mary to escape persecution, ended up in France. But there's a whole community there that had the full gospel of Mary Magdalene in Languedoc, France. And so back I think it was in the 90s, they published it kind of anonymously, the Gospel of the Beloved Companion, which purports to be the full gospel of Mary Magdalene. And it's really interesting to see. But it's much more, it's much more about the inner teachings of Jesus rather than just teachings about ethical behaviors. It's about Kenosis, which is knowledge. That was published a couple decades ago, I think, and really revolutionized my understanding of Mary and what she experienced.
Yeah, I've heard of that. I haven't looked into it in detail, but I've certainly read some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, like the Gospel of Thomas, and I've heard people talk about it, and it's cool to hear it from you because you're a professor from Naropa, and so sometimes when I hear people talk about some of these alternate histories of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, it can go off into a little bit of like a sci-fi,
right?
You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah, well, like the Da Vinci Code,
right.
That was a story, yeah. But the scholarship of it is pretty solid about Mary Magdalene. Really being, as they called her, the apostle of the apostles, I believe, is what Saint Augustine called her.
Oh wow, yeah. Well, that's high praise.
Not Jesus. Yeah.
Well, the other thing you just said that really struck me was this quality of learning and growing, even within Jesus, even within, the so-called Son of God. And that there's actually, it just made me think that I think part of the problem, part of the damage maybe from religion as it's often taught and understood is this idea that there is a perfect person that did have it all together. Right. And then we compare ourselves to them, and of course we're not that person. And I think that affects us on such a deep level if we want to go to Carl Jung's unconsciousness and the archetypes. But we grow up with this, so many of us, especially in this culture, have such an intense inner critic. And I think it must be connected with, on some level, some of these ideas about God being perfect, Jesus is perfect, I'm not perfect, and that stays with us, for our lives.
Right. Yeah, you're totally right about that. No, the Christian mystical understanding is that there's no such thing as static perfection. Wow. To be perfect is to be on the journey continually. Because the interesting thing in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, even their view, say, of something like heaven, was that there was no end to the growth that would occur on whatever the next life might be. There's no end to the growth. It would continue for all eternity. So they didn't see that much difference from whatever the next life might be from this life, because this life is meant to be constant growth. As St. Paul said, from glory to glory, from one light to the next light. There's this real evolutionary kind of process view that perfection is just to keep growing. That's what perfection is. Wow. And there's the realization that if we didn't have all of the things that we mess up in, we really wouldn't learn anything. Yeah. I mean, it's that age-old teaching that all the traditions have, is if you don't have any darkness, you'd never know the light. That teaching is in Christianity from the very beginning. Yeah. So the sort of static perfection really makes no sense.
I love hearing that. It feels so refreshing to hear that, and it's making me remember a story I heard about Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, who founded Naropa, where we were at, and he's kind of the wild, crazy, whatever you want to think of him. But someone asked him one time, according to the story I heard, what happens after enlightenment? ? And he said, well, enlightenment is just the beginning. It's like after you awaken, then you have to spend the rest of eternity helping everyone else.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that brings up another thing, this idea about perfection. It's really quite oppressive. And we see it in these days where people expect, major figures to be perfect in a moral sense.
Yeah, yeah.
Each of us has a flaw. Each of us has something that we have struggles with. That's a beautiful thing, because that means we need other people to help make up where we fall short, and they need us. And it's endless. We all need each other. So that's what glues the world together. The fact that we're not perfect in a static sense, and the fact that no religion has it all, means we each need each other. So when people see, now we're having exposed all of the the teachers who, practice sexual abuse. And I mean, it was happening at Naropa in the Buddhist community when I was there. And so you have students that want to reject all the teachings of that teacher because their personality was flawed. Well, guess what? All of us have a flaw in our personality, and that doesn't negate the teachings that come through us, sometimes independent of us. So we've gotten into this sort of hyper-perfectionism in our own time, where if it's discovered that a particular figure of the past was sexist or racist or homophobic, they want to discount all of their teachings. And the point is, no, they had a certain part of the truth in their teachings, but they didn't have it all. So that means we need others to make up for where theirs fall short. It doesn't mean we reject their teachings. It just means we realize they're partial. And that is true with every last one of us. Wow. And it's a beautiful thing, because it means we need each other. We really do.
I love that so much. It feels so good to hear. I think it's so true.
Well, every tradition talks about it, right? I mean, in Christianity, it's the body of Christ. Paul says, should the hand say to the eye, I don't need you? Should the eye say to the foot, I don't need you? I mean, each of them specializes, and each of them, there's something they can't do that the other organs can do. So we value, like I'm probably an eye. I'm all about vision, but I'm horrible sometimes with the feet. Like I don't know how to put it into practice in all, situations. So often we have a spiritual teacher that has the insights, but they often don't have the means to practice it. So somebody else, another disciple comes along, and they see where their teacher, had some flaws, where they didn't fully practice it. They weren't consistent. So they are the ones that put it into practice more completely than the teacher did. And then someone else comes along and says, well, you guys, there's whole areas that you haven't even seen, how we need to practice this in a new context. But Jesus himself said that. He says, you will do greater, he was talking to his disciples, you will do greater things than I have done, basically because I'm disappearing in this form and I'm going to go back to the source. He says, you will do greater things than I have done. So he himself admitted, that his disciples would see things in new ways. So what a wonderful thing that each of us has a flaw, because that means we need each other. It's not a fatal flaw that's going to, quote, send us to hell. It's just each of us is a piece. We're each a part of the body. We're at each organ in the body, or in the Buddhist image of the net of Indra. Right. Each jewel is different than any other jewel, or the web of life. I mean, a crow, I've got crows outside playing in the wind. They can't be a jay, and a jay can't be a crow, and I can't be either of them. So it's beautiful. We all need each other. So this idea of static perfection is actually being carried to a incredibly oppressive, it's so intense in our time, and it's really sad.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate the way you're talking about that. That's the idea of static perfection as being oppressive. Whether you're a religious person or not, whether you're on the left or the right, doesn't matter. It's that same impulse to tear people down because they're not perfect in some way.
Well, we've lost the simple human faculty for critical thinking, which is that we're we're able to look at each teaching, say, and okay, well, I see this part of that teaching is really positive, but here's some other parts where they didn't get it. Let's say it's got some sexism or racism or homophobia, right? Well, that's part where they didn't get it, but they got this part of the teaching. And here's another teaching, and it's got, it's better in some areas, but it doesn't see the full story there. And then here's another teaching, and same with spiritual teachers or people. We each get part of it, but there's other parts we don't get.
Right.
So critical thinking is able to sift the light from the shadow in everything we encounter, and then piece together the light. That the Jewish teaching about raising the sparks, that each creature and each human being has a spark of the divine life that's hidden in a kind of clay vessel. And so we, through our love and faith, are meant to uncover that spark, heighten it, and fan it into flames so that it can join all the other sparks. Each of us has that spark of the divine in us, but our clay vessels sometimes obscure it, sometimes hide it. It's really a beautiful thing, just the ability to have critical thinking in the sense of separating light and shadow in absolutely everything, including our own tradition. So we embrace a particular tradition, in my case, Christian mysticism, but realizing that it has certain blind spots, that it has certain flaws to it, that it's not perfect. I embrace it because I think it's the one that has the worldview I think best describes what I see in the universe, but I realize it doesn't have it all. There are other traditions that have a better understanding of other areas. So it makes for a beautiful world. None of us has it all. We don't have it all in our traditions. We embrace the path that we feel is the best, that we feel called to, but we know it's not perfect. On a multitude of levels, static perfection is not viewed as a thing that we really would want.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that a lot again. Yeah, I mean, I guess I would add to that, within the realm of religion, spirituality, you can sort out the light and the dark, and then to go to another place with it, to not expect any one path to be the answer to everything. For example, maybe this is a great teaching on how to meditate, but over here is a great person who can help you run a business, and over here is how you can learn about interpersonal relationships, and over here is about the ecology, and to expect one group or one guru to have all of that is insanity, right? We have such a big world, so many different domains of knowledge. I think that when people get really into a particular path, they get tunnel vision and they lose sight of that.
Right. You might say it's a patriarchal view. I don't like that word because I think patriarchs are a thing, but insofar as it's a negative.
What did you just say?
A patriarch is a person who is a male leader who can be looked up to.
Oh, wow. That's the first time I've heard the word patriarch be used in a positive sense in about 10 years, so thank you for that.
Remember, I was a part of the mythopoetic men's movement that Robert Bly and Sam Keen back in the late 80s and early 90s. It's really sad there hasn't been another men's movement since then, which is to say, to get in touch with sacred masculinity. We see a lot of toxic masculinity now. But a true patriarch is a person who has wisdom and takes the heat when others that work for them make mistakes. They don't blame it on someone else. They take the heat. They take the responsibility, and they're an honorable person. And so a true patriarch is good, just like a true matriarch. When we talk about patriarchal culture, I think we're talking about the negative kinds of aspects. But really, my point was that when we expect one leader, one path to have it all, that's what I would consider patriarchy. Whereas I think what we really need is a realization that's all relational. We all need each other. There isn't going to be any one. There isn't going to be any one person that has it all. I used to talk when I was in seminary. Ask women. Who would be a woman that corresponded to Christ? And of course, this was including when we were talking about Mary Magdalene. But oftentimes the feminist would say, actually, we wouldn't point to any one person. It would be a whole community of people. Oh. And so I think that's what we need in our world now. It's a whole community of religions, a community of paths, a community of different perspectives. That's where the divine lays.
I like that. I
That's the
appreciate
whole
that.
point of the teaching on the Trinity. Is that you've got these two poles and they're constantly emptying into each other, and the unity is in between the two, not in either one of the two poles. It's in between the two, and that's exactly what Trungpa taught. It's in that place in between where the energy is.
Yeah. I got to ask you, are you familiar with the work of Ken Wilber? Has that been an influence on you?
Yeah, had a huge influence on me, actually through my spiritual mentor, Thomas Keating, because he started to frame the whole Christian mystical path in terms of the earlier work of Ken Wilber. I haven't followed some of his most recent work where he coins lots and lots of different terms, but yeah, especially his earlier work with the different sort of stages of spiritual development influenced me incredibly.
Yeah, me too. I think he's massively influential and not talked about or as widely known as I would expect. He's kind of, I hear or see people saying things that I can tell come largely from his work, and that it's not in the common knowledge. It's not there as much. So
I do disagree with him on some points.
Sure.
I think it's nature mysticism on a lower level than some of the other levels, and I disagree with that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, a big criticism of his work is his tendency or obsession to rank everything as better or worse, kind of like it's kind of tiring. Yeah.
Hierarchy. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. So for you, obviously, nature mysticism is huge, and is that something that happened just spontaneously in your life?
I think it happened early because as a kid, like in elementary school, I often felt like I didn't fit in. So I would go out into nature. I would go out into the woods and fields and marshes and streams in Pennsylvania, and I'd feel accepted. And then when I got to junior high, I had a real problem. I felt inferior to the girls. I turned red every time I talked to a girl, and I just had real social awkwardness. So I found nature was where I could go and find a communion with a presence that I felt accepted me and understood me.
Wow, yeah.
It started very early. And then later on, I realized that nature was where I found, my spirituality the deepest, especially the wide open spaces. When my dad took us on a vacation in the West, I fell in love with the West, the wide open spaces, the deserts, the mountains, the wilderness. And then I started to see a lot of the Christian mystics used landscape terms to talk about the divine.
Interesting, yeah. I appreciate you bringing that about feeling socially awkward and finding relief in nature when you're alone. And I can relate to that, but I think it's also, no matter how social or extroverted you are, when human beings are around other people, there's this social dynamic that tends to dominate our consciousness, and it's not a bad thing at all, but a lot of spirituality, meditative traditions take that away, and you're with yourself or you're with nature, and then that can almost just by itself, it's a kind of release from that worry about what are they thinking about me, or how do I look, or what am I going to say, or...
That's why solitude is such an important spiritual path. I have one day of solitude every day of the week. Every week I have one day of solitude.
Oh, wow.
And then every afternoon I have a time of solitude. And then as well as extended retreats. And I think, yes, solitude is absolutely necessary for discovering your inner source, for that true relationship with the divine.
Yeah, your inner source. I like that. Well, another thing I wanted to ask you about from our conversation just now, and maybe you're more free to talk about it since you've retired from Naropa, I don't know, but there is the big scandal with Shambhala and the leader, Sakyong Mipa Rinpoche, who is accused of different kinds of abuse, including sexual abuse, but it was more than that. It was like around money and power, basically, I think, too. And I had a few episodes at the start of this podcast. People can go back if they're interested and listen to them about that. I talked to Judith Simmer Brown, and I talked to the lawyer. Her name is Carol Murchison, if I'm remembering correctly, who helped investigate the whole thing. And she was a wonderful person to have on, and very critical of the Shambhala organization and how they've handled it. Did you have any thoughts to share about all that and being at Naropa and I don't know, wherever you want to go with that?
My feeling is that institutions in general corrupt spirituality because humans are involved. It doesn't matter what spiritual tradition you're in. It happens in absolutely every tradition. It's just that people used to idealize Buddhism. They say it all happened in the Judeo-Christian tradition or maybe some Hindu gurus. But so now we're just seeing it happens there too because humans are involved. So it's human institutions. And when people look up to one person, so it's just, it's part of the human condition. I'm not surprised. But what I thought was tragic is when students, I used to read every one of Trungpa's books I could get my hands on. I thought he was a genius. I thought he was one of the most creative thinkers that I had ever encountered. He really helped me with a lot. As a person, I saw him in person, at Christian and Buddhist conferences that Judith Simmer Brown had organized at Naropa in the 80s. Yeah, he had his flaws for sure.
He was probably drunk when you saw him.
He was drunk, yeah. But that doesn't take away from his teachings, because in a sense, his teachings don't come from him. They come from a source beyond him. So when I started to see students dismiss Shambhala and his teachings, I thought it was tragic. Again, it's an inability to practice critical thinking. Separate the teachings from the person and realize if the person's flawed and did unethical things, it doesn't denigrate from the teachings. Same with the Sakyong Mipham. I read several of his books. I thought they were wonderful. But as a person, gosh, he's got his flaws. So separate the teachings out from the person. I mean, every figure I taught in the history of Christian mysticism, you could do the same thing. You could see how they were oppressive. Maybe they supported the Crusades. Maybe they were misogynistic, certainly homophobic. So you realize, that part of them, that's the shadow side. That's not good. But that doesn't take away from the things they did get.
Yeah.
So when this broke with Shambhala, I'm like, welcome to the human condition. So separate out the things that are true from the things that are flawed. And always hold on to both the perception of the flaw and how, there was real abuses on the one hand, the other hand, wonderful, beautiful teachings that aren't complete in themselves, but they're at least a piece of the puzzle. So
that's a refreshing perspective.
People, I used to tell my students, in the Gospels it says, the same measure that you judge by, you will be judged by. So can you imagine? So we want to root out every last person that, has been abusive or is sexist, racist, or, homophobic. But just remember what future generations will do to us.
That's an interesting one to think about. I've thought about that,
We hope that they'll see the good things we did too. We hope that they'll see the internet and some of our technology and some of what we've developed psychologically. But they'll see that we caused global warming. They'll see that we experimented with animals for our cosmetics. They'll see all sorts of abuses that we did. So we hope that they have the ability to exercise critical thinking to separate the things that we did that were good and contributed to humanity and the things that were horrible. So, same thing happens with anybody in the past or anybody that we see that's fallen short now. The same measure by which you judge, you could be judged. And I don't want any part of that. I want it to be able to see clear-eyed when there's abuses, but not forget the good parts that are there as well. Jesus talked about the parable of the wheat, the wheat and the chaff. How they would have these piles of wheat, and then they would take a pitchfork in the Middle East and then throw it up into the air, and then the grain would fall, and then chaff would blow away. So Same with each of us. Each of us is full of wheat and chaff. And so, yes, the chaff needs to be admitted to. Yes, we need to own our own chaff, but it can't be forgotten that there's wheat there too. Sometimes despite us, because life is a gift. It was given to us.
Interesting. Yeah. I wonder, do you have any thoughts to share about this whole just having a spiritual teacher in general? And it seems like you're advocating to understand that we're all human, we all have flaws. But a lot of people today are we're no longer in the age of the guru. I've heard a lot of people talk about that. And
Right.
Do you have any thoughts about that to share?
I think it's important for those of us who are older to live lives of integrity. Because what I saw at Naropa was students were desperately looking for a mentor.
Yeah.
They wanted somebody who was older, who could tell them that, life is good, and who had some kind of a path and lived lives of integrity. I saw what happened when, let's see, 2 occasions, Reb Zalman Schachter Shalomi, he would talk regularly at Naropa. Here you have this room full of 20 and 30 somethings and listening with rapt attention to a man in his 80s.
Wow, yeah.
I saw the same thing happen when Gary Snyder visited. I think he was in his 80s as well.
I saw him talk there. It was amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think it's really important for those of us who are elders to live lives of integrity and to work through our issues. And that's another thing I didn't mention. A lot of the scandals are about men. Yeah. And I think male teachers, I think men have not worked through their sexuality. And that includes, quote, spiritual men. We got to work on that stuff. We can't shoo it under the carpet. We can't just say, bad, 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 don't do that. We need to work on it and find, transmute it. What's the sacredness there? So I think it's importantly, especially for male teachers, to really work on that stuff. Really spend a lot of time working on it to uncover what's the sacredness and what's the stuff, that needs to be gotten rid of. So I think it's important to have a teacher or series of teachers. However, in the Christian tradition, the ultimate teacher is the indwelling Holy Spirit. So we used to discuss that when I was on a retreat at the monastery with Thomas Keating. I think it's dangerous when you look to one teacher to sort of mediate to you the spiritual teachings, when you look to them alone, because in the Christian tradition, it's the indwelling Holy Spirit, and the teacher is supposed to always point you to that indwelling Spirit. So the teacher will always fail you because they're on the way too, and I used to tell the students, it's like we're all on the way. And so the journey is infinite. And so it's like the teacher has gone 1 centimeter along the spiritual journey, and the student has gone 1 millimeter. That's compared to all of infinity. So we might know a few things and can guide, but we're on the journey too. It's the indwelling Holy Spirit that we must trust, who will lead us into all truth, as Jesus said.
Yeah. I guess, we're on the subject before I move on. I've just had people write to me, especially after the episodes around Shambhala, and they were very upset and hurt and wanting to destroy the organization or blame the organization, or I don't know. I'm not even sure how to ask it in a question here, but just that I hear what you're saying about how we're all human and we're all on this path together, we're all learning. But then there's some, obviously, spiritual teachings and traditions where there is a guru at the top, and he is taught to be all perfect in some ways, and that's what leads to these scandals we're talking about. And so what you're saying is actually pretty radical. And if a Buddhist organization really adopted that, that would be a huge change for them versus saying the guy at the top is perfect, which is kind of what they're saying, right?
Yeah, I think it's dangerous to have a teacher as your prime source, to have that be the one that you look to. I think it's very dangerous. No matter what tradition you are in, there has to be a way that teacher points you to what's within your own inner being. And the student has their problems too, but at least then they'll be making their own mistakes instead of the teacher's mistakes.
Yeah.
Follow the teacher. So that's another reason I'm a Christian, is because of that emphasis on the indwelling spirit. I mean, John O'Donohue talked about it. Yeah, we each need a soul friend, an anam cara, which is the Gaelic word for a trusted confidant. And it's good if there's someone who is older that sort of knows the ropes, but that's what there are. They're a soul friend. They're not the master. Right. But that's my Christian perspective, is that masters are dangerous. You know, it's even Jesus is a guy comes and said, "Good teacher, what must I do to be saved and become whole?" And he says, "Why do you call me good? Only God is good." Always pointing away from himself in a lot of the Gospels. Yeah.
Okay, I appreciate that a lot. Yeah, and so in fairness to the Buddhist teachers I've studied with, pretty much all of them, I could say that I consider my teachers are very humble, and they're always they'll talk about their flaws and they'll talk about their own teachers, and so I think in the Tibetan Buddhist world, there is when it's working well, there is a kind of accountability that's a part of the tradition where you have all these other teachers that and students and kind of keeping tabs on each other. And I wonder if with Shambhala, it was kind of isolated and kind of its own thing and became its own kind of, it wasn't quite a part of that world in the same way, if that makes sense. And
I see what you're saying. Yeah, maybe so. I can't speak to the organization or the hierarchy of Naropa or Shambhala, because it's not, especially Shambhala. I remember seeing the guys walk around the Shambhala Center in Boulder with they all had these suits and this little pin, on. That was foreign to me, having this sort of hierarchy or levels that people have gone through. And I don't know I'm not much of an institutional Christian, not at all. My tradition, actually, that I embrace now comes from the Radical Reformation. So there is the group of the Anabaptists in the 16th century. So the Anabaptists that most people know of are Amish, Mennonites, and maybe Hutterites who have farms like in North Dakota and Montana, and they have a communal. So the Anabaptist movement, which emphasized simplicity and living the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor, blessed are the peacemakers, and so forth. But there was a wing of the Anabaptists in the 16th century who church historians called the Contemplative Spirituals. And they're sometimes called the tradition of the invisible church. They basically believe that every institution is flawed, and that there isn't any church that is the right way. So they believed that church is, as Jesus said, where two or three are gathered, there I am in their midst. So they practiced. A Quaker scholar talked about them being the Christian Heraclitus. Heraclitus is the one that said you never step into the same river twice. Oh yeah. So rather than a community meeting in one place and there's a leader and all of that sort of thing, it's more community is spread out over time. So you might get up in the morning. So in my case, I get up in the morning, I have devotions with my wife. There's an instance of church. We go out on a hike and are out in the beautiful Taos landscape. There's an instance of church. I see crows playing in the breeze and feel a communion. There's church. I talk to somebody at the coffee shop, have a meaningful conversation. There's church. I may go to a talk or workshop. There's church. There's a beautiful sunset in the evening. There's church. So it's spread out over time, and it's basically invisible. It's not gathered in any one place. And they love to quote that verse in Jesus where people say, what are the signs that the kingdom of heaven will occur on the earth? He says, don't believe anyone who say it's here, it's there. He says, for the kingdom of heaven is within and among you. It's invisible. He says, the wind, he says, you cannot tell where it's coming from or where it's going. It's kind of spontaneous. He says, so is everyone who's born in the Spirit. There's a spontaneity to it, and it's non-institutional. And that's basically the tradition that I follow. There isn't any one teacher, but it changes complexion throughout the day, and every day is different. Church is different every day. So yeah, I'm not the right person to ask about any institution. I think institutions, though they can be necessary for a time, are innately flawed.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Yeah. Whew. I guess, yeah, I mean, at their best, they are helping create community and hopefully doing good things. But yeah, there's always that. I think it would be good for there to be more checks and balances and processes in place to catch these things earlier on.
Yeah.
I think if we became a more mature society, we would have that there more, you know?
Well, what we aspire to with a democracy, where there's multiple checks and balances, like you said, there's not just one person that can, have all the say.
Yeah. Beautiful.
I know that as far as Naropa goes, of course, they sort of severed themselves from the Shambhala organization, but I thought the spirit of Naropa was very beautiful. I really enjoyed my time there.
Oh, good. Yeah. And the school is really founded on this interreligious dialogue in large part, right? And bringing, like you said, Thomas, I don't know if Thomas Merton went there, but Father Keating and...
Yeah. Yeah, I went to quite a few of those interreligious dialogues, Christian and Buddhist, and they were wonderful. Yeah, that interreligious dialogue that is there at Naropa is just absolutely wonderful.
Yeah. Oh, man. Outside my window is a squirrel eating my prayer flags. You must have heard us talking. It's destroying them as I watch it. Oh, well. Yeah, and to her credit, Judith Simmer Brown has devoted a lot of her career and life to that interreligious dialogue process. So
Yeah, that's right. She's really important in that. About intraspirituality, I remember I went to talk to Thomas Keating a couple of years before he passed away. And I wanted to talk about interreligious dialogue. And he stopped me. He said, no, wait a minute. It's intraspirituality that we're really talking about as a world now. So I think, that's really important. Because a lot of young people, they don't find themselves really relating to any one tradition.
Right.
They find that there's pieces here and there, and they get criticized like they're being egotistical because they're like having a cafeteria style, and they're just going to absorb teachings and practices that are going to pander to their ego. But that's why I think the book, The New Monasticism, is so important. It shows that path of piecing together, of insights you find is very difficult. Because you have to constantly discern, is this coming just from my ego, or is this a real truth? And it can be lonely. There isn't any one teaching or dogma that you can adhere to. You're constantly having to listen to the inner spirit to discern what's true. And that's very challenging.
Yeah. It's a complex topic, and it's challenging. And I remember looking at, there's poll data, like the organizations that ask people questions all around the country. And I believe the fastest growing demographic in terms of religion is the quote unquote spiritual, but not religious.
Yeah.
And
or
I don't think that's say what?
Nuns. Yeah. Yes.
I don't think that's a bad thing, actually. I think what you're talking about is not necessarily a bad thing. People are intelligent. People are smart. People are trying to figure out what's true and what works for them. And that's good.
No, I agree. And it makes complete sense to me. And so I think the future of institutional religion, I'm not sure what's going to happen to it, but and the thing is that many spiritual but not religious people are very they believe there's a divine source. They have a relationship to a divine source. They just can't categorize them in any one tradition. And there are regional differences as well. In North America, the Pacific Northwest has the highest percentage of nuns, or spiritual but not religious.
Interesting.
And then Denver, Boulder actually is one of the others that is quite near the top.
Oh, well, makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. And some of it, they say, is because people that live, there's studies done that that compare the sort of quality, what we would consider beauty in a landscape. They see how many nuns there are, NONES, in that area, and they've determined that areas that have some of the most stunningly beautiful landscape have the most nuns, because people go to nature to find their communion with the divine.
So what is that word you say, nuns? What is that standing for?
NONES. So on the Gallup polls, what's your religious tradition?
Mm-hmm.
It has a whole, series of things you can check off, and then the bottom is none.
Oh, just none.
So the number of nuns is growing. In that, so some nuns are maybe consider themselves atheists or agnostics, right? Okay, but then others would consider themselves spiritual but not religious.
Right, that's what I was talking about. Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, but the category of nuns is huge.
It's growing big. Yeah. Well, you can't blame them. I mean, the scandals with Catholicism alone is just so massive and so hard to wrap your head around, and so sad.
So sad.
Yeah.
But that's an institution for you. That's a person coming from the contemplative spiritual position, is that institutions will eventually fail you. But at the same time, I realize how, as I said before, especially young people hunger for spiritual mentors. And it's so important for us to live lives of integrity. So important.
That's a great message. Yeah.
Because people soften their boundaries toward a teacher. It happens naturally. And it's so important that you, as a teacher, have a life of integrity, and that you don't try to get your human needs met through your students.
Right. Great point. So important. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so at the same time that I don't really have much good to say about institutions, at the same time, I think that the spiritual teacher really needs to walk their talk.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I think humans, we have a need for, like you're saying, mentorship and teachers of all kinds. And in our culture, which is so individualistic, like a lot of my life, it's like there's this sense of like having to do everything on your own, or you're learning from YouTube, and that's okay. But like to actually connect and follow other living humans is very valuable, and not we don't always learn that or get that modeled, and it's not always easy, and it can feel awkward. But I think it's a part of being human that's so important that we need more of.
Well, the Anam Cara, the soul friend.
Yeah.
And as we're talking, I think that Celtic Christianity, it's having a real resurgence now. Is people are really attracted to it. Number one, it doesn't focus on the institutional. Number two, it's egalitarian, and in that tradition, men and women were valued equally. For example, Saint Bridget of Kildare in Ireland was an abbess of a monastery, of both a male monastery and a female monastery.
Oh, wow.
But the connection to nature is another huge aspect. So Celtic Christianity is really experiencing a resurgence. And of course, it was suppressed by Roman Christianity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd love to learn more about that. I love the symbolism, the Celtic cross, and some of the designs. They're so amazing. Oh no, sorry about that.
That's all right.
This has never happened before. Well, okay, it says 1 hour, 26 minutes. I think it's all recorded here, so. Yeah. Oh, that was weird. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Maybe now is a good time to wrap it up.
Sure.
This is a great conversation. I really appreciate it a lot.
It has, and you've really asked some very pertinent, important questions.
Oh, good. Yeah. Yeah, that's what happens when you're a religious studies student for years.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, good. I will link.
It's great to hear some of your path too, Julian.
Great, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'll link some of your links on anything you want to let people know about where they can find you and learn more about you.
To be honest, I mean, I have a web page, but the place to really find me is on Facebook.
Okay.
I publish photos. I am obsessed with taking photos of natural beauty every day of my life. and posting them with inspirational quotes and sometimes my own thoughts. So on Facebook, you can find me, and you can find those photos and those thoughts just about every day.
Awesome. Yeah, and I've seen some of them, and they're gorgeous. So thank you for sharing this.
Yeah.
Great. See you next time.
All right. Thanks. Good to see you, Julian.
Thank you so much for listening to another episode of A State of Mind podcast. As always, if you'd like to support this, one of the easiest and free ways to do so is just share about it with your own friends and family on your own social media accounts. You can leave us positive reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And as always, you're welcome to call in or write us, send us your messages, questions, feedback, inquiries. All of that is welcome. You can learn more about my other work that I do as a therapist, meditation teacher, and coach at astateofmindcounseling.org. And if you'd like to directly support the show and become a member, you will receive some guided meditations as well as additional art and music and other things that we are cooking up here. You can do that at patreon.com/astateofmind. Thank you so much, and I will see you here next time.